Okay, let's go and get started. This is finishing a 4-week sermon series on forgiveness. That God forgives means that Jesus lives. And because Jesus lives, we know that God forgives. We know that as Christians, Ephesians 4:32, we're supposed to forgive one another. And we talked about what that's not, that sometimes a misunderstanding of forgiveness is to condone somebody else's sins or to allow them to continue to berate us with their sins, that they would make those mistakes over and over again. And we would allow them because we're supposed to forgive. Ignoring somebody's sins isn't forgiveness either. Being victimized over and over by somebody else's sins. So we talked about what that's not. And ultimately we talked about what it is. What forgiveness really means is to have perspective. And I know it has a lot of different pieces and elements to it, but really one of the things that empowers us as Christians to forgive in the act of forgiveness is that we have a perspective on what it means to forgive. Because Jesus, even in the midst of being on the cross, said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's ironic, isn't it? Jesus presents a perspective that is greater than anyone else at the time, and really from the beginning of time to the end of time. And yet he was the one on the cross. He was the one suffering and dying. And the reason for that is that he had an eternal perspective, the will of the Father. And when we are anxious or angry or upset or victimized, we often lose perspective. We think that that moment is bigger than God, and nothing is bigger than God. God is bigger than this trial, this set of circumstances, this other person's actions against me. And the more Christians can live according to that practice of faith, that we are a people who forgive and we are a people who overcome, then the world is transformed, one forgiving moment at a time. Well, today we'll wrap up the sermon series with that question that I think has been lingering, this sort of yeah but question. And the yeah but is, yeah, I understand what you just said, but there's other pieces to this that I don't think quite go along. One of those questions is, yeah, but who do I forgive then? I mean, if it is complicated or complex, how do I have perspective? And does that mean that I forgive everyone? Does that mean I forgive my enemies? Does that mean I forgive somebody who continues to harm and do harm against others? Do I do that? Do I over and over? Do I forgive? How does that work? And this sort of story of when we get the perspective of Jesus' perspective to forgive, then we enact that forgiveness upon others because it is a representation of who Christ is in us. Let me put it this way. This sermon series is going to come full circle. We started with the resurrection and the cross, the death of Jesus, the resurrection on Easter, and it was about who Jesus is. And Jesus lives. And by acknowledging the life of Jesus Christ and the resurrection, we understand how God forgives. Then we talk about the next couple of weeks about others. How do we forgive others? What not to do in the act of forgiveness, and what forgiveness really means when we're considering the sins of others. And today we're going to bring that full circle back to us. How is that really about me? Well, let's start with a parable in the Bible. Matthew chapter 18 has this story. And it begins because Peter has a question. We've alluded to this over the past few weeks. Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone? 7 times?" "No," Jesus replied, "not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Little backdrop. In Genesis, there's a reference of a great-great-grandson of Cain. It comes sort of out of mysterious chapter 4 of Genesis, where he says, vengeance, anyone who enacts vengeance upon Cain is going to have vengeance acted on them 7 times. But against Lamech, it will be 70 times 7. It seems to represent that there was an ancient tribute to vengeance, that this would fall upon you and your next generation to 3 or 4 generations, that vengeance was something that was passed down and would be multiplied. And Jesus is turning that on its head and saying, now I tell you that you enact forgiveness 70 times 7. That this is something that we do more often among one another. It's a characteristic of our group, of our unity with Christ. So Jesus says, no, not 7 times 7, 70 times 7. Then he shares this parable. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors, so he's got a whole bunch of debtors in front of him, he's got one in particular who owed him millions of dollars. Now, in the Greek, it says 10,000 talents. Now, this is significant because 10,000 is the highest number in Greek, and talents is the highest amount of money. So literally what Jesus is saying is that the debtor owes the king an insurmountable amount of money, more than just what a person would owe a king, more than countries owed whole countries. That's a little bit different for us to consider today, how big of a debt that person's debt is to the king in the story. There was a fire in the San Diego County back in 2003, and a lone hunter was lost. Fearful for his life, he started a fire to get a signal to people that he could be rescued. He fibbed about it, lied about it, didn't come clean for a matter of months. And the reason is because by the end of the fire, the fire known as the Cedar Fire of San Diego County ended up doing about $2 billion worth of damage. 280,000 acres, 2,800 buildings, and in fact, 15 people lost their lives. Can you imagine being that hunter, that individual who started a fire knowing it shouldn't have happened? It was too dry. It was illegal to start fires regardless, but for whatever reason, fearful of his life, he did what he shouldn't have done. And you can see how it amounted to so much more. I think there are moments where we overlook our debt to God, that we think something is so simple and it's just maybe something we shouldn't have done, and then we see how it's compounded to this problem of the curse, of a great concern in our society of sinful people. The servant owes a debt that is far greater than he could ever repay. Now, I will tell you that means that the king and the debtor look kind of foolish in the story. When Jesus is telling this, the hearers are going to be listening to this going, wait a second. One, how did he get so far behind? Wouldn't he know that the king would take his life or enslave him as a result of his actions? And on the flip side, the king seems foolish. I mean, why would you allow somebody to enact accrue on a debt that is larger than what countries owe countries? We're not talking about an individual debt. Now we're talking about, by our today's standards, billions, if not trillions of dollars, right? Jesus goes on with the story. In the process, the debtor was owed so much money he couldn't pay. His master ordered they be sold into slavery, along with his wife, his children, and everything that he'd owned to pay his debt. Now, we know he can't pay the debt. It would be a minuscule amount what he would gain from selling the debtor and his family and selling his things. But the man fell down before his master and begged, "Please be patient with me, and I will pay it all back." Then his master, filled with pity for him, released him and forgave his debt. Of course, the king knew he wouldn't be able to pay it back. It would be impossible. But he forgave his debt. Now that sort of sets up this second chapter of this parable, if you will. When the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. Now this is how he responds. He grabbed him by the throat and he demanded instant payment. And it's a little bit different, isn't it? That the king is doing what the king was expected to do, that you went before the king at certain times and debtors routinely paid back their debt. Now this servant finds someone out on the street, which is quite legal for him to enact his judgment and his tone that he wants to be repaid. He wants to be repaid immediately. But it seems a bit harsh after knowing the first part of the chapter. And then it becomes even more impossible to believe that he grabs him by the throat. So where the king threatens to send him into slavery and sell his whole life belongings, he doesn't. In fact, didn't lay a hand on him, just threatened him. Here, this man has become incredibly harsh to a servant who owes him a few $1,000s, what would really amount to a few months in wages. It's a lot, it's significant, but it's not impossible to repay. His fellow servants, the servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me and I will repay you. But his creditor would not wait. He had the man arrested and put into prison until the debt could be paid in full. And again, the servant of the king now threw a person who owed him money into prison. He demands to be repaid. That debt can actually be repaid. But word gets back to the king on how this has been handled. A few servants went to the king and told him everything that had happened. The king called the man he had forgiven and asked, "You evil servant, I forgave you a tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant as I have had mercy on you?" Then the angry king sent the man to prison until his debt was paid in full. There's an understanding in this moment, two things that I want to make sure are part of our process of understanding forgiveness. First of all, the man displaced his own guilt onto another servant. Just because the king forgave him didn't mean that the man understood, that the servant understood the forgiveness. And clearly he doesn't, because he takes out his frustration on someone who owes him. It's very important for us. It's like going to work, and when somebody says you've lost something or misplaced something, you forgot a deadline, and you go home and you can't find the remote, so you are incredibly upset and outraged. I share this with the church often, that there's times when somebody will ask me or would be upset, displacing that anger on the church or with the pastor. For a time, and I still do at times, get defensive about that, but now I've sort of learned that this can't be that big of an issue for that person. There's something else going on. And it tends to become a conversation about a deeper concern than something as simple as we changed a meeting date or the color of the carpet. We make bigger issues out of things with others as a means to displace our own guilt. If we have not accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, that is one of the biggest challenges we'll face. We can't forgive others. When Jesus says to the disciples in the Sermon on the Mount that if you forgive others, God will forgive you, that's what he's talking about. George Herbert said, to forgive others or to not forgive others is to break the bridge that you at some point will have to cross yourself. And I think with our metaphor of forgiveness as a verb, this bridge between the subject and the object, certainly the object of God's affection would be us. Certainly the subject of, in many stories in our lives, are the loved ones and relationships that we have. And to be able to bridge those relationships and restore them means we have to understand the power of forgiveness. It isn't that Jesus forgave us that changes everything. It's our willingness to accept it. If I can't accept Jesus' forgiveness, then I'm not going to be able to forgive others. In the end, I hope there is something in you that will be that you're willing to acknowledge and pray. That you would be willing to say, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes, and those mistakes pile up to a debt that I cannot repay. That there is a holy God that requires an enacting of judgment upon the sins of this world. And to understand that and to live rightly in his kingdom, I am going to need to repay that debt. And because I can't, I'm going to need it to be forgiven. How much more should I turn and forgive others? Jesus says in Matthew 6:12, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. To love your neighbor as yourself. Think of that commandment with forgiveness in mind. God forgives. And we know that because Jesus lives. And you and I should forgive others. And maybe that should start by forgiving ourselves. Allowing our sins to be forgiven by God accepting and acknowledging that and living free within the power of forgiveness, so we too can forgive others.